Hi everyone. It's been raining for a couple of days in Puerh city. We're in the middle of the rainy season, and that kind of weather invites you to enjoy black tea or ripe pu'erh tea. So today I'm going to talk about ripe pu'erh tea, shupu, because a couple of days ago I received an email, a question from a customer who asked, why do we have so many not me, but in the Western world, on the Western market, why do pu'erh tea vendors tend to offer more and more shupu? And is it a trend that's reflected, that's the same as on the Chinese market? So I'm going to discuss this very briefly. So when I first arrived in Yunnan in 2010, shupu was mainly mass-produced, and it was kind of a kept secret. I think even officially the production technique of shupu is a state secret. But even back in 2010, it was not really a well-guarded secret. It was still possible to learn that technique. Although usually vendors and producers would give you the impression that producing ripe pu'erh tea was required a lot of skill, a lot of experience, and was a very complicated process. Throughout the years, this ripe pu'erh processing got demystified because, well, the technology leaked. More and more independent factories opened their own fermentation rooms. Employees, more and more people got the skill to do the fermentation. So usually you will work as an employee for Dai, and after a couple of years you will leave the company and start your own business. And since you have that reputation of having worked at Dai, you're supposed to be good at fermentation, so your business will run well. And so in the past 10 years, that's what has happened. We've had more and more skilled workers who've created their own business, retired like fermentation masters who now work as consultants. So basically you pay them by the kilo, and they come a couple of times, maybe once every couple of days, to inspect your pile and give instructions, and they can make a lot of money that way. So there's been a propagation of the technique to make ripe pu'erh. So it's not the hunting ground of the big factories anymore. In the past, the only really good shupu you could get were from Dai or a couple of other big factories, maybe Puerh, for example. Nowadays, it's fairly easy, even though it requires some investment, some capital to start this. It's not a huge barrier to entry, the knowledge and the capital. Second, from 2010 to now, we've still had economic growth in China. That means a lot more middle-class people who are able to afford a slightly more expensive tea. While in the past, maybe an average family would buy a cake for $5. Maybe they can put $30, $40, $50 into a cake now if they enjoy the tea. People can afford that kind of tea nowadays. So there is more demand. At least the consumers can withstand the increased price of ripe pu'erh. If you look at the big market, I think in terms of mass market, there's more ripe pu'erh produced than raw pu'erh. And it's for historical reason. A lot of people, like in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Guangdong, in the southeast of China, in the traditional culture of pu'erh tea, they will never touch young raw pu'erh. This is more of a new culture that's going on. So if you don't like young pu'erh, you can either buy aged pu'erh tea or ripe pu'erh tea. And of course, the price of aged raw pu'erh tea has been increasing exponentially, and nowadays it's very hard to find good aged shang especially at affordable prices. So maybe in the past, people who would buy aged shang would now rather buy more expensive ripe pu'er, which will still fit their budget and maybe fit their taste. Also think of all the public places where tea is served, like restaurants or offices, where you don't really want to break the bank for the tea. Then a cheap ripe pu'er tea will be the tea of choice in southeastern China. So so basically the cheap raw pu'er teas are only suitable for aging, because most of the young raw pu'er tea market is on the high quality side. So in terms of cheap tea, either you buy raw pu'er as an investment and you're gonna age it for maybe 10 years before it's drinkable, either you buy some ripe pu'er and can sell it straight away. But it doesn't answer the question, why do we have more and more higher end ripe pu'er tea? So we said, because people are richer, because the technology is more accessible, and actually also because aged raw pu'er is more expensive than before, so the alternative, the replacement product, is more expensive. And the fourth reason, and the least obvious of them, is because there's been a change in what is done in Monghai. In the past, even back in 2010, the roads were quite hard to access. The business connections between the farmers and buyers were not very well established, which means that there was a lot of business in just sourcing Maocha. You live in Monghai and you go to Bulangshan, you go to Mongsong, Nano, Bada, and get some nice tea, try to get a good price for value, go to remote villages and get the tea, bring back the tea in Monghai for your customers. But nowadays, with the advent of WeChat and the more and more convenience, you could say that this business model is outdated. Few people will be willing to buy Maocha in Monghai with the markup of the middleman, knowing that they can go directly to the tea mountain, get a couple of WeChat connections, and then get a lifetime of supply direct from the farmers. So what was the solutions for all these wholesalers who were specialized in sourcing Maocha? They had to find a new way to sustain their livelihood in Monghai. And so what a lot of them did was opening some fermentation factories. So there's also this drive, because their former job was threatened, the Maocha sourcing is being outdated, they turned to making fermented pu'er tea. And of course, since there is more competition, more people fermenting tea, there is a push for innovation, because you have to stand out in the crowded Monghai market. So what does this increase in numbers of supplier of ripe pu'er tea producers means for the consumers? Where is the innovation driven regarding ripe pu'er tea? So first, since a lot of these former Maocha middlemen ran modest operations, they couldn't really compete on low cost and large volumes with the established tea factories. So what some of them did is going into the high-end segment of the market, actually creating a high-end segment for the ripe pu'er tea market, because usually, like back in 2010, really, ripe pu'er was the cheapest tea you could find. And you could say it's still the majority of the market nowadays uses very cheap material for making ripe pu'er. You see all the plantation tea that you see everywhere in every village of southern Yunnan, all the summer tea of the famous tea mountains, they are all used mostly for making ripe pu'er tea. It's rare to use this material to make raw pu'er tea. So we have this market which is dominated by cheap ripe pu'er tea, and then these new entrepreneurs try to establish a higher quality segment. What do they do to achieve this? First, they want to have a technique for fermenting lower quantities, because you cannot collect like tons. Basically, in the big factories, the typical pile will be 5 to 20 tons. Minimum would be like 2 tons. And so there's been work on understanding how to do that fermentation on a smaller scale. So first, I remember in 2015, around that, we were talking maybe 100 kilo, 200 kilo, so what we call small piles. And recently I've even seen, like my neighbor here, Mr. She, he's fermenting tea in his basement, and he's made a sophisticated area in which he ferments tea by micro batches. What I call micro batches is less than 20 kilo. So usually he will make like 10 kilo, a batch of 10 kilo. And having small quantities like this, it allows you to use very high quality material, because you can risk the material and you have the capital to buy the material. If you want to buy 2 tons of Laomana Gusu, well, you need to have you need to be a good friend with the bank, or you need to have a lot of capital yourself. And the risk is very high, because what if the fermentation turns wrong? So having lower batches allows to take more risks, and so having higher stakes batches, you could say, with better material. And actually, it's by trying these smaller batches with higher quality material that you realize how shitty the material is that they use in the big piles. Like, I think just using the same fermentation technique but using better material, it will have a big impact on the quality of ripe pu'erh. I wasn't convinced of this a couple of years ago, but my recent experiences have changed my mind. Then they try also to use different mediums. So you know that the basic technique is you spray water on the top of the leaves of the pile, then the water will permeate through the pile, and it will kind of sit down. So usually you want a concrete floor, so that a bit of the water will be absorbed by the concrete and kind of diffused on the sides. But people have tried different methods. Some will try, for example, having a pallet, so having an airflow down the pile, and somehow they manage with a permeable textile, they manage to hold the pile above the ground with a layer of air flowing down. So of course that will allow the water to evaporate from the lower side, and also oxygen to enter through the pile from the down up. I think I've seen fermentations done in kinds of caskets, or little crates. So these of course are variants of the traditional fermentation techniques, and people who do this try to at least control the information and to keep that a little secret, but eventually the secrets leak, and what works is adopted by other factories. Another big source of potential improvement would be to prepare the water you're going to spray on the leaves. So for example, you could grow bacteria in the water. So you could prepare your water, grow bacteria in the water, and then spray the water on the pile. That will give you what we call a mass effect, which means that suddenly the selected strain of bacteria that you want will totally overwhelm the pile, and that might help change the ecosystem in your pile. If you don't do that, the microorganisms will come, they were naturally present in the leaves, or they will come from the ambient air. And maybe that's also the ambient air that can be a factor why fermenting in different places leads to different results. Now, if you look in the industry, in many fermented products like sausage or sauerkraut or yogurt, the industry will go to great ways, will go to a great extent, put great effort into developing specific strains that will give a typical taste. I've heard about it being done in Puerh tea, but it seems to still be a very tiny part of what's made. As far as I know, most of the fermentations nowadays are made the natural way. Recently I tried something made by Dai, which says it is done with what they call probiotics, so it's a nice way to call bacteria actually. And yeah, it tasted different. So I guess we can see that kind of industry taking off and expanding. I think it could open a lot of new horizons on the ripe Puerh tea spectrums. For example, craft beer, if you can find so many craft beer nowadays, it's because it's been made much more simple to make craft beer, because some companies sell you the whole package of all the microorganisms you need to do the beer fermentation. And apparently, maybe storing the fungi and the yeast and stuff is a more rather recent technique, and that's what enabled a lot of microbreweries to arise. At least that's what I've heard. So maybe we could see the same thing happening with the shupu, and you could have some kind of custom microorganisms grown for you to make your own house taste. I think we're still far from that. But the fact that we have now customers who cannot afford aged raw Puerh tea, but don't like young raw Puerh tea, but are still willing to spend good money on tea, these customers will be very interested in more original ripe Puerh teas. And why do you find that in the Western market? I think it's because it's a market that tends to value innovation even more than China, because we rely our customers are tea enthusiasts, while in China the bulk of your customers are not necessarily enthusiasts, they are just used to drinking tea. You could compare it to the wine market in France, you know, where most people are not particularly knowledgeable, but will just buy a lot of wine. So Chinese people buy a lot of tea, and maybe habits also means that innovation can be a bit slower. So maybe innovation will touch more the younger, wealthier, more urbanized people, and that's what drives the innovation. And of course, there's still a huge market for the basic cheap ripe Puerh, so it's no concern actually for the big industry. So these are my thoughts about the ripe Puerh. We're going to expand our range of ripe Puerh. You've seen that it's been the desert in the past months regarding ripe Puerh. This is a nice one from Monkou. It's fairly small batches, and we're going to press it into cake. The maucha is really beautiful, and the smell is really quite different. So I've met a couple of people who are doing a great job at tea fermentation in Monghai, in Jinghong, even in Puerh, and I'll be happy to expand my my offering of ripe Puerh. In the past, I thought that ripe Puerh was mainly a very boring tea and a cheap ersatz for aged shang, but yeah, the things I've tried in the past years have changed my mind. So I'm looking forward to putting those new products and researching even more that aspect, and maybe doing our own batches. This is a project that's been going on, but we haven't started the project yet. So thank you for watching, and see you later. Bye bye.